I always knew betrayal tasted bitter, but I never imagined it would be served on my wedding night by my own maid of honor. What followed wasn't just heartbreak, it was a silent, slow-burning scheme of revenge only a woman who has lost everything can execute. My life, at that dignified age where one assumes most storms have passed, had finally coalesced into what felt like a truly gilded, second-act dream. I was a woman on the cusp of marrying Walter, a man I had meticulously envisioned for years, not just as a loving companion, but as the quiet anchor for my remaining chapters, my sanctuary from the world's ceaseless clamor. Every meticulous detail of our late summer nuptials was a testament to patience and enduring hope. The heirloom lace, the selection of vintage Bordeaux, the string quartet playing pieces only Walter and I truly appreciated, everything bespoke a profound, quiet commitment. Marjorie, my mother, a woman who had seen and survived decades of life's unpredictable twists, wept elegant, genuine tears as she adjusted the pearl clusters on my ivory gown. In that moment, glancing at my own reflection, dressed in a garment that whispered of decades-long hopes, finally realized, I believed, utterly, that I had secured my unassailable happiness. What a magnificent fool I was. I was standing at the threshold of a ceremony meant to validate a deep, mature love, completely oblivious that it was, in fact, the prologue to my most devastating tragedy. A betrayal so profound it would make the very notion of trust feel like a cruel joke. From the first moment of planning, it was a given that Doris Jenkins, my oldest, dearest friend, would be at my side, closest to the altar. Doris was not merely a friend. She was the living repository of my history, my soul's acknowledged confidant, the only person, I believed, who understood the intricate, often messy, landscape of my heart. Naturally, I bestowed upon her the honor of maid of honor without a scintilla of doubt. No one in our established circle questioned the choice. Everyone was acutely aware of the deep, almost sisterly bond that had sustained us through the decades. Her smile, as she carefully arranged my veil and fussed over the train of the gown, appeared to me then as the very epitome of sweet, unadulterated devotion. This detail, I later realized, was the first, terrifying clue I ignored. What I failed to perceive was the malignant, carefully constructed facade behind those seemingly gentle, supportive eyes, a dark, volatile secret preparing to unravel my meticulously constructed existence from the inside out. You won't believe the lengths some people will go to when envy takes root. We had opted for an incredibly private affair, intentionally distant from the intrusive clamor of the city, desiring a sanctuary commensurate with the gravity of our vows. Our choice fell upon an exquisite, secluded estate nestled deep within the rolling hills of Virginia. The property was truly breathtaking, a magical blend of old-world dignity, a magnificent stone manor house, its walls steeped in history, inviting, cozy guest rooms, and a grand ballroom defined by colossal windows and soaring ceilings that welcomed the final, golden, wistful light of the setting sun. Here, enveloped by our dearest family and the few intimate friends who truly mattered, we planned to formalize our bond, beginning what we naively assumed would be a peaceful, shared life. Nothing about the setting felt remotely disharmonious. Everything radiated an almost perfect, poised tranquility. Yet, it was precisely this place, this supposed haven, that was poised to become the silent witness to the most excruciating, protracted collapse of my world. The location, by the way, holds the key to the next twist. Stay tuned. The entire estate, including all ancillary buildings, had been leased for the entire weekend, ensuring that our parents and the complete wedding party could reside on the premises both before and after the ceremony. Our intention was for this to transcend a mere event. We wanted it to be an experience of shared moments, enduring laughter, and serene, collective anticipation. The evening prior to the wedding, we hosted a convivial dinner on the sprawling flagstone patio. It was illuminated by the soft, warm glow of countless string lights, complemented by the restrained sounds of quiet jazz and the gentle clinking of wine glasses. Walter appeared remarkably composed, perhaps even unusually affectionate, and Doris, naturally, maintained her familiar, constant presence at my side. No one, least of all me, could have possibly suspected the catastrophic, life-altering storm that was already brewing beneath that veneer of calm. That night, I retired to my room with my heart buoyant with almost childish hope, replaying the day's gentle rehearsals, profoundly convinced that enduring happiness was finally mine. I drifted into sleep late, feeling that peculiar, nervous excitement of a woman who knows a profound, beautiful change awaits, picturing the exact moment I would glide down the aisle toward Walter in my white gown. I should have paid closer attention to the silence between the words that night. The next morning, the very first, tentative rays of sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, and I woke with a sudden, boundless surge of energy, a feeling I hadn't genuinely experienced since my youth. Doris was the very first person to enter the room, bearing a tray with my carefully prepared breakfast, her face graced with a smile that, in my later, tortured memory, solidified into a terrifying, flawless mask. I felt nothing but profound gratitude, excitement, and unshakable security. The awful, tragic irony was that I was completely unaware that the bedrock of my reality had already been fractured, that nothing I was experiencing was genuine anymore. When the appointed hour finally arrived, my father, George, a man whose strength I had always relied upon, offered his arm. Together, we began our slow, deliberate procession toward the sprawling garden where the entire congregation awaited. The delicate, ethereal sound of the string instruments, the path liberally strewn with creamy white petals, the tear-filled, glistening eyes of our loved ones, it was all picture-perfect, lifted directly from a storybook. Walter was standing vigil at the very end of the flower-laden aisle, his eyes shining with what I took to be emotion, the same beloved smile, the one that had captured my heart so many years ago, fixed upon his face. I proceeded toward him, forcing back the rising tide of my own tears, absolutely certain that I was embarking upon the most significant, beautiful journey of my entire existence. The ultimate shocker? My I do was merely the starting gun for my greatest, most unimaginable personal collapse. When the officiant, an old family friend, posed the central question regarding our acceptance of this lifelong union, I didn't hesitate not even for a breath. My response, though a little tremulous, was undeniably firm. I do. My gaze was saturated with love as I looked directly at Walter. He, in turn, offered his I do, accompanied by his fixed smile, although, in a fleeting, unsettling microsecond, I registered a momentary, almost imperceptible dimming of his eyes, an odd lapse in expression. I immediately dismissed it, of course, rationalizing it as nothing more than the profound, universal anxiety that even the most grounded individuals feel when undertaking such an enormous, irrevocable step. We exchanged a prolonged, passionate kiss to the sound of thunderous applause, completely encircled by the fragrant white floral arrangements and the visible tears of shared joy. In that instant, a moment I tried desperately to immortalize, I believed without question that every challenge had been worth it, that our mature, enduring love was unequivocally real. The subsequent reception unfolded exactly as we had meticulously planned, intimate, impeccably elegant, and seemingly bursting with pure, unadulterated happiness. We dined beneath a sky pinpricked with countless stars, the air filled with soft background music and the hypnotic flicker of candles strategically placed upon every table. The moments were punctuated by bursts of laughter, sentimental anecdotes, and what appeared to be utterly sincere embraces, as if we were all unified in witnessing something eternal and true. Walter moved easily among the guests, engaging in light conversation and laughter, yet I couldn't shake the distinct, cold feeling that his attention, when it fell upon me, was strangely distant, a thread that had momentarily gone slack. I actively pushed the concern aside, convincing myself he was simply exhausted from the exhaustive planning, resolving instead to savor every precious second that remained. My father, George, visibly moved, eventually stood to propose the formal toast to our union, speaking with palpable pride about me and the beautiful, deep way he had observed our love blossom over the years. Everyone heartily applauded, and Walter raised his glass with his well-practiced, fixed smile, though something in his eyes, that lack of genuine, reflected emotion, betrayed the superficiality of the gesture. I scrutinized him, trying desperately to locate the familiar, beloved spark, but all I found was an unsettling, deep-seated silence in his gaze. I internally chastised myself, telling myself I was being overly sensitive, perhaps even paranoid, searching for non-existent cracks in a flawless edifice. But deep down and insidious, creeping fissure had already begun to form within my soul, a quiet, internal collapse I wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Little did I know, that distant look would soon turn into something truly horrifying. After the final toasts and the music began to fade, we ascended to the bridal suite, a warm, beautifully appointed space we had personally adorned with fresh flowers and scented candles, intended to be the scene of our unforgettable first night as husband and wife. My heart was beating a wild rhythm against my ribs, a complex cocktail of excitement and sharp, nervous anticipation for the profoundly special night ahead. I gently closed the heavy door, instinctively wanting to extend and savor that moment of private intimacy, truly believing we were about to irrevocably seal our long-awaited story with deep, reciprocal love. Walter unceremoniously dropped his gold watch onto the nightstand, shed his shoes without glancing my way, and exhaled a heavy, dramatic sigh. I moved toward him, intending to offer a soft, welcoming embrace, and that's precisely when the cold, flat words hit me. "I'm tired," he stated simply, his voice dry and utterly flat, devoid of any genuine connection, as if I were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the room. I froze mid-motion, momentarily stunned, attempting to ascertain if this was some bizarre, ill-timed joke or if some catastrophic event had transpired without my knowledge. But his face was a mask of cold seriousness, distant and completely empty of any discernible desire or emotion. He turned his back to me without another word, swiftly unbuttoned his dress shirt, and walked directly toward a small twin bed discreetly tucked into a far corner of the expansive room. He offered no goodnight, made no gesture of comfort, didn't even turn his head. He merely extinguished the main light, plunging the luxurious room into a silence that felt infinitely more painful than any shout. I sat down heavily on the edge of the enormous marriage bed, completely paralyzed, unsure of what to do with my body or my frantic thoughts, feeling utterly invisible on the night that was supposed to define our union. I waited for what felt like endless, agonizing minutes for any form of acknowledgement, a small gesture, a whispered word, a bare explanation, but all that reached me was the steady, quiet sound of his indifferent breathing from the far side of the room. I eventually, slowly, lay down upon the bed, unable to stop the silent, hot tears now streaming down my face, desperately trying to muffle my sobs so as not to appear utterly pathetic. The room was still heavy with the sweet scent of the fresh flowers, yet inside my chest, a terrible, fundamental withering had begun. And that's precisely how I passed my inaugural night as a wife, profoundly alone, drowning in confusion, and nursing a soul already irrevocably broken. You have to wonder, where was the shame? I have no clear recollection of how long I lay there, staring into the impenetrable darkness of the ceiling, irrationally wishing the whole agonizing experience was just a terrible nightmare, praying that Walter would suddenly appear and surprise me with a warm, genuine embrace. But the hours dragged on, the silence was absolute and oppressive, and his body remained inert in the isolated twin bed, as remote from me as if we were separated by vast continents. At some point, sheer emotional exhaustion claimed me, and I finally closed my eyes. However, I could not have been asleep for more than a brief 30 minutes when a low, muffled sound abruptly jarred me back into a state of intense, fearful awareness. I sat bolt upright, my heart slamming violently against my ribs, confused, desperately trying to localize the source of the noise. I turned my head sharply, and the sight of Walter's twin bed confirmed my rising dread. It was empty. I slowly rose, my bare feet making contact with the cold, unforgiving floor, feeling a tight, inexplicable knot forming deep in the pit of my stomach. I crept toward the door, eased it open with agonizing caution, and heard the distinct sound again. It was a brief, severely stifled groan, a noise clearly made by someone making a frantic effort to maintain absolute silence. The long hallway was immersed in near total darkness, illuminated only by a faint, suggestive sliver of light emanating from a room situated at the very end of the corridor. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, trying to cling to any logical explanation, perhaps a low television, a conversation in the distance, anything rational. But a terrible, cold certainty was already forming deep within me, the visceral premonition that I was about to hear something I was never meant to know. I forced my legs to move, still prioritizing absolute silence. And that's when the horrifying detail clicked. I recognized the room at the end of the hall. It belonged to Edith, Walter's mother. Edith had mentioned, quite casually, at the conclusion of the rehearsal dinner that she felt slightly unwell and needed to drive into town to procure some specific medication. She had not been seen since, and no one, including Walter, seemed to have voiced any concern regarding her prolonged absence. My mind began the terrifying process of constructing the impossible sequence of events, yet my heart adamantly refused to believe the emerging truth. What plausible reason could Walter have for being in that specific room, his mother's room, which was supposed to be completely vacant, in the dead of our wedding night? I took one more careful step. The sickening groans continued, now slightly more subdued. I moved down the endless hallway, my heart pounding a panicked drumbeat, a cold, clammy sweat breaking out across my back, desperately attempting to suppress every single footfall to avoid alerting whoever was secretly inside. My distress was no longer solely about the noise. It was the cruel, undeniable fact that Walter was not in our marital bed on the most sacred night of our lives. And in that very moment, in that specific, damning location, something fundamental within me began to make chilling connections, isolated, ignored details, fleeting, strange glances that had seemed utterly insignificant until now. I resisted the emerging picture. I desperately did not want to imagine the full, ugly scope of it. But my feet were already autonomously leading me, and my soul had a shattering premonition. It was about to break into a million irreparable pieces. I halted precisely in front of Edith's door, the same one I knew was supposed to be empty that night, and I felt my hands begin to shake with an uncontrollable, violent tremor. From behind the solid wood, the groans persisted, lower now, as if someone was deliberately holding their breath, almost as if they suspected they were being overheard. I swallowed a painful, dry lump in my throat and pressed my ear against the wood, holding my own breath for a protracted moment so I could discern the sounds more clearly. The sickeningly soft creak of a bed, a muffled, satisfied sigh, and then, distinctly, a woman's voice. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying, desperately pleading to be wrong. But I recognized it instantly, irrevocably. It was Doris. There was no room for denial. Her voice, her unique cadence, was utterly unmistakable. Broken, urgent whispers, a sickening, perverse mix of pleasure and secrecy, seamlessly blending with tiny, familiar laughs that I had shared and cherished in confidence countless times over our decades-long friendship. I felt a massive, brutal blow to my chest, as if I had been physically knocked to the unforgiving floor without any warning. I leaned heavily against the cold wall, dizzy, disoriented, unsure whether I should unleash a primal scream, turn and flee in terror, or simply collapse into unconsciousness right there on the carpet. Everything we had shared, every intimate secret, the endless teenage confessions, the mature promises of unwavering loyalty, it all came crashing down around me with that horrific sound. But the true, gut-wrenching pain had yet to reveal itself. And then, unmistakably, I heard his voice. Walter's deep, familiar, betraying baritone, whispering Doris's name between low, guttural gasps that obliterated every last shred of doubt I might have been desperately clinging to. I felt the very ground dissolve from beneath my feet, the air in the narrow hallway thicken into an unbreathable, viscous substance, and I realized, with stark terror, that I was losing my ability to draw a breath. It was the voice of my husband, the man who, only a few precious hours prior, had publicly sworn an oath of eternal love to me in front of everyone who mattered. And now he was there, in the consuming darkness of the middle of the night, intimately sharing a bed, the bed he had so cruelly refused to share with me, with my supposed best friend. The tears finally erupted, torrents I was completely unable to stem. Yet, remarkably, I did not make a single sound. I rested my forehead against the unforgiving cold of the wall, shaking violently, feeling smaller, more utterly insignificant than I had ever felt in my entire life. I struggled to comprehend how this unimaginable act could be unfolding on my wedding night, in the very house where I had believed my beautiful new life was officially beginning. Every syllable, every groan, every breath they shared was a searing, agonizing dagger plunged straight into my soul. Still, I remained fixed in place. I made the conscious, agonizing decision to stay right there, rooted in front of the locked door, maintaining an absolute, silent vigil, waiting for them to emerge so I could finally face the tangible architects of my destruction. I needed to see their faces, to hear the hollow sound of their inevitable excuses, to definitively confirm with my own eyes the horror I had just absorbed through my ears. Time stretched out into an eternal, slow-motion torture. Every minute was a distinct agony, and my heart battered against my chest with a wild, desperate force. I closed my eyes, opened them, I was still there. I did not retreat. The door abruptly swung open, and Walter emerged, his dress shirt hanging half unbuttoned, his expensive belt askew, running a restless hand through his disheveled hair, as if completely unprepared to encounter anyone. When his eyes landed on my frozen figure standing directly in front of him, he stopped dead, instantly petrified, his eyes wide and the unmistakable stain of guilt brutally tattooed across his face. He was speechless. He merely spun around, a gesture of profound cowardice, as if frantically searching for an immediate explanation for his own vile treachery. And then she appeared. Doris followed closely behind him, her once perfect hair completely disheveled, her carefully applied makeup smeared in streaks, her costly dress a crumpled mess, holding her heels uselessly in one hand. The moment she saw me, she too froze, rooted firmly to the spot, looking as if she had just confronted a terrifying apparition, instantly losing the ability to flee or even meet my dead, steady gaze. I needed no further evidence. The horrifying image of the two of them standing together in that agonizing, guilt-ridden silence spoke louder, more definitively, than 1,000 words ever could. And yet, I found my broken voice and dared to ask the simple, fundamental question, why? I stood utterly immovable between them, blocking their path, my body tense and rigid, my voice a raw, broken instrument shaped by an uncontrollable rage and pain. I demanded to know how they could have committed such an act, how they possessed the ice-cold depravity to betray me so completely, so callously, on the most meaningful night of my life. Walter could not settle his eyes anywhere. Doris did not even attempt the pretense of surprise. Silence was their initial, utterly contemptible response, as if they somehow expected me to simply fade away without uttering another word. But I did not move. I did not fall silent. I refused to grant them that easy, convenient escape. Then Walter, his voice rising with nervous, forced energy, began to stammer, telling me I was mistaken, that absolutely nothing had transpired, that he had merely been helping Doris retrieve some items his mother had inexplicably left in the room. His lie was so clumsy, so patently absurd, that for a single, shocking moment, it inflicted a greater, deeper wound than the betrayal itself. Doris remained completely mute. She simply looked down at the floor while he continued to desperately invent excuses, each one more transparently fragile than the last. He glared at me as if I were the one responsible for losing control, but his pathetic theatrics had lost all power over me. I calmly informed him that I had overheard everything, every whisper, every shameful groan, every word that should never have been shared between them. I made it clear that he had no need to continue his performance, that his silence, his guilt-ridden presence, had already definitively confirmed the whole ugly truth. At that point, Walter slowly dropped his shoulders in defeat, closed his eyes for a long moment, and finally, weakly, admitted the transgression in a low, exhausted voice, as if he no longer possessed the strength to maintain the cruel charade. He offered no apology. He did not attempt to explain his motivations. He merely mumbled that he had been confused for some time, as if that pathetic explanation somehow justified the brutal magnitude of his betrayal. Doris immediately dissolved into violent tears upon hearing his quiet confession. She buried her face in her trembling hands and began to repeat, over and over, that she was profoundly sorry, that she had never intended to cause me pain, that she didn't know how things had ever escalated to this tragic point. Her tears failed to move me in the slightest. It was too late for sorrow, too late for regret. For decades, she had been the single person I trusted without reservation. And she had plunged a dagger into my back with brutal, efficient deliberation. She was no longer my friend. She was not even a recognizable stranger. She was a threat. Standing before me was nothing more than an empty, hollowed-out woman. I felt something essential within me violently fracture into a million pieces, something without a clear shape or name, yet something that contained the very essence of who I was. My legs were shaking uncontrollably. My chest was a searing, painful inferno, and I could barely breathe, as if the very air itself was betraying me just as they had. I did not weep again. There were no tears left to shed, only a silent, searing, consuming rage that began to build and burn deep within my core. My wedding night had devolved into a sickening, twisted nightmare, and the woman who stood there was irreversibly changed. I spoke no further words. I turned and walked slowly back to the bridal suite, gathered my personal belongings without sparing either of them a glance, and descended the grand staircase. My white gown was still on, my face was burning with humiliation, and my soul was shattered beyond recognition. No one attempted to follow me. I walked across the dew-kissed garden barefoot, completely oblivious to the cold bite of the early morning air and the ghostly fog that was beginning to shroud the ground. My singular, desperate need was to escape, to disappear, to draw a breath of air that was not polluted by their repulsive lie. And so, I left the scene of my ruin without a single farewell, without providing any explanation, carrying only a broken heart and, crucially, my dignity, which, despite the crushing pain, remained remarkably, defiantly intact. But I knew, with chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning of a long, dark road. I walked for what felt like endless hours, without a map or a destination, along deserted, winding roads. My beautiful dress dragged in the accumulating dirt, and my makeup was a sorrowful, smeared shadow beneath my exhausted eyes. No cars passed by, no one stopped to question my strange, solitary trek, and in a perverse way, I was grateful that the rest of the world continued to function, entirely ignorant of my sudden, profound tragedy. I finally collapsed onto a damp bench next to a desolate, dry field, shivering from the relentless cold, replaying the overheard sounds and the sickening images, endlessly, obsessively. I could not begin to comprehend where and when everything had gone so terribly wrong. This was my wedding night, and I was utterly alone, emotionally destroyed, and hopelessly lost. When the sky began its slow, agonizing transition toward dawn, I retraced my steps, guided more by physical exhaustion than by any conscious, deliberate decision. The estate remained unnaturally quiet, still enveloped in sleep beneath the faint, deceptive light of the early morning, behaving as if nothing remotely dramatic had transpired. I slipped in through a back door without making a sound, feeling like a profound intruder in a place that, only hours ago, had been the sacred stage for my happiness. I had no articulated plan, but something deep inside me demanded closure. I knew I absolutely could not depart without publicly confronting the truth. The dining room was already buzzing with hushed voices, the clinking of porcelain plates laden with fruit, steaming coffee mugs, and the oblivious smiles of our friends and family, all of them behaving as if life were continuing its natural, predictable course. My parents, my now former in-laws, the entire wedding party, They were all chatting lightheartedly, completely unaware, oblivious to the catastrophic reality that had transpired in the utter darkness. I stood observing them from the shadowy doorway, feeling a cold, intense surge of fury grow within me at the sheer normality of the scene. No one immediately inquired about me. No one appeared to have noticed my sudden, prolonged absence. I subtly wiped my face, walked determinedly into the room, and firmly requested their attention. With a steady voice, remarkably calmer than the tempest raging inside me, I asked everyone to immediately gather in the main living room. I harbored no desire for dramatic confrontation or beating around the bush. I had a statement to deliver, a truth to reveal, and I would not delay it any longer. My father, George, turned to me with an immediate, deep look of worry. Marjorie, my mother, rose instantly, and one by one, everyone filed into the spacious living room, confused and expectant. I immediately scanned the crowd, noting the glaring absence of Walter or Doris among them, an absence that, in itself, spoke volumes. As everyone settled into their chairs, my eyes deliberately swept the room one final time, searching for them, harboring a faint, final hope for one last, cowardly appearance. But neither Walter nor Doris were present. They had not possessed the basic courage to show their faces, and their blatant, confirming absence made my task easier. My parents grasped the gravity of the situation instantly, looking at me with a profound unease, as if they already knew that the words I was about to utter would be devastating. And then, standing tall, without any discernible tremor in my voice, I spoke. I began by calmly thanking them all for having joined me on what was supposed to have been the happiest day of my long life. And then, without any hesitation, I delivered the unvarnished truth. I told them, plainly, that I had discovered Walter and Doris together, intimately, in his mother's room, on my wedding night, betraying me without a shred of shame or regret. I heard the instant murmurs, saw the universal furrowing of brows, the tense, shocked expressions, and felt their immediate disbelief wash over the room. But my voice remained strong, unbroken, because for the first time in hours, I felt an extraordinary sense of control returning to me. The looks on their faces were almost worth the pain. An absolute silence immediately descended upon the room, a heavy wave that seemed to sweep away every remnant of conversation and composure, and no one initially knew how to react to the sheer horror of the confession. My mother, Marjorie, covered her mouth with a shaking hand. Walter's parents looked down, as if unable to bear the immediate, crushing weight of the shame. A few guests stood up in shock. Others stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, unable to process the reality. Crucially, no one refuted my statement. No one attempted to defend the guilty pair, because deep down, everyone knew that the woman standing before them was utterly incapable of fabricating such a profound, terrible lie. With a clear, ringing voice, I announced my irrevocable intention to annul the marriage, stating that I wished to have no further contact with Walter or Doris ever again, and that I expected no one to attempt to persuade me otherwise. I was not soliciting pity or sympathy. I demanded only respect for my final, considered decision. My father, George, immediately rose and wrapped me in a long, silent, rock-steady hug, a gesture that spoke volumes, as if he were silently communicating his pride in my strength. No one applauded. No one protested my choice. They simply allowed me to depart. As I exited the room, I distinctly heard Edith, my mother-in-law, quietly descending into sobs, and her husband making a futile attempt to comfort her. My own parents' eyes were red-rimmed, not from personal grief, but from a helpless, searing anger that they had been unable to protect me from this profound cruelty. I felt as if I were leaving behind not merely a failed wedding, but an entire version of myself that had ceased to exist. Disappointment hung heavy in the air, a bitter, pervasive perfume that every person present was forced to inhale. And in the midst of all that profound, shared emotion, I simply walked away without looking back. I departed the estate grounds without a single backward glance, taking absolutely nothing with me but my inherent dignity, the very same dignity that, despite the crushing pain, still managed to remain resolutely upright. The white dress, once a symbol of purity, was now permanently stained with the ground's dirt, my private tears, and the awful history of a story that no longer belonged to me. I walked toward the distant road with my head held high, like a survivor emerging from a catastrophic storm without having completely lost her soul. I ignored the relentless phone calls, the stream of text messages, the probing questions. That entire section of my life was, effectively, dead to me. When I finally arrived back at my quiet, empty home, my soul still raw and bleeding, I immediately contacted my lawyer and initiated the divorce proceedings without any delay. I harbored no desire for days of reflection, for mediating family counsel, or for the destructive illusion of second chances. I intended to close that harrowing chapter with the same unyielding firmness with which I had attempted to live it. I handed over the necessary documents and adamantly refused to see Walter again, not to talk, not to sign papers, not for anything. I was fundamentally no longer the same woman who had uttered "I do" at that beautiful, lying altar. The betrayal was over, but my new purpose had just begun. Weeks melted into months. The world outside my hermetically sealed life assumed I was merely suffering the profound grief of an unexpected divorce, especially at an age when stability is prized above all else. They saw the shell of Evelyn, the woman who had lost her fiancé and her lifelong best friend on the same treacherous night. But inside, I was no longer grieving, I was calcifying. The raw, searing pain had dried up, replaced by a cold, dry, surgical anger. I didn't seek sympathy, nor did I allow myself the destructive luxury of self-pity. My new companion was clarity, razor-sharp, and utterly unforgiving. My lawyer, Mr. Hamilton, a distinguished gentleman of 75 who understood discreet discretion better than anyone, handled the annulment swiftly. I refused all contact with Walter. I refused to hear his pathetic excuses or see his guilt-stricken face. He was an irrelevance, a stain I was meticulously scrubbing from my memory. The financial settlement was generous. I insisted only on the return of the estate I had purchased myself and a clean legal break, rejecting any claims on his inherited assets. I didn't want his money. I wanted his future to feel less secure. My family, my mother Marjorie and my father George, were my unshakable foundation, their silent, protective anger a comfort far surpassing any words. They watched me, not with pity, but with a deep, proud recognition of the steel I was forging. I dove headfirst into my small, struggling business, an antique and luxury consignment shop I'd established a decade prior. I poured every drop of my physical and emotional energy into it, using the crushing weight of work as a shield and a distraction. The shop, previously a pleasant hobby, was now my fortress, my sole purpose. I started working 18-hour days. I overhauled the entire inventory, ruthlessly applying my sophisticated taste, expanding into rare European textiles and mid-century art. I cultivated new, powerful relationships with wholesalers and interior designers who valued my precision and my newfound, almost desperate drive. I didn't just want to survive. I needed to build something so solid, so unassailable, that the actions of Walter and Doris could never touch me again. The best revenge, they say, is living well. But I knew a much more satisfying kind of revenge. Word soon trickled back, carried by the inevitable, gossipy current of our social circle, that Walter and Doris had shamelessly moved in together almost immediately. Their betrayal, it seemed, was not a drunken mistake, but a premeditated, calculated plan. They paraded their new arrangement as a great, fated love, a passion that justified the wreckage they'd created. I heard that Doris was glowing with a false, brittle confidence, having finally secured the man she'd coveted for years, my man. And Walter, always narcissistic and susceptible to flattery, believed he had found the great, authentic connection that transcended my stifling love. I didn't need to see them to know their supposed happiness was a mirage built on quicksand. How could a connection forged in such cold-blooded deceit ever truly flourish? But I did not interfere. I did not speak their names. I did not need to. I understood the natural order of things. Treachery always pays its own cruel debt. This is the point where most people expect me to break, but I was just getting warmed up. I began to study them, not with rage, but with detached, clinical observation, like a scientist examining a doomed specimen. I listened to the subtle signals coming from the edges of our mutual acquaintances. Doris's former confidence began to fray. Whispers spoke of sudden, violent arguments, yelling matches that sometimes spilled into the street of their new, leased townhouse. Walter, predictably, was becoming restless. He was a man who craved the novelty of the chase, not the predictable routine of domesticity. Doris had sacrificed her longest, deepest friendship for a man who could not, and would not, commit to fidelity. She became clingy, obsessive, constantly checking his phone, the paranoia of a woman who knows exactly what a man is capable of when passion cools. Walter, feeling trapped and seeing his faded passion turn into a smothering routine, began to seek escape. It wasn't love they shared, it was a punishment they inflicted upon each other. He was getting bored, and a bored Walter was a dangerous, predictable creature. The collapse of their perfect relationship was not a slow decay, it was a sudden, violent implosion. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, Walter disappeared. He didn't answer his phone, didn't leave a trail, and didn't bother to inform Doris. She arrived home to an empty house and a hastily scrawled note, discovered taped to the refrigerator door, a final, cruel flourish of his signature cowardice. He had, naturally, found a younger woman, someone completely disconnected from our history, someone whose admiration was fresh and unquestioning. He had simply repeated his established, destructive pattern. It was never about me, never about Doris. It was only ever about his ego and his juvenile desire for the next validation. Doris was left utterly alone, financially precarious, without a partner, without the circle of friends she had so easily cast aside, and devoid of any credibility. She finally, truly understood the agonizing vacuum she had so carelessly inflicted upon me. The beautiful irony was thick and satisfying. She became me, only without my supportive family or my inner strength. Doris, stripped of Walter and the supportive network she had so readily betrayed, began a swift, pathetic descent. Her former friends, mine, essentially, had zero tolerance for her treachery. My parents, Marjorie and George, had permanently blocked her number and politely but firmly informed her mother that the bond was severed. Her carefully constructed world dissolved into a pathetic dust heap. She desperately sought solace, outreach, anything to fill the void, but found that no one forgets a betrayal of that magnitude. She finally experienced the crushing, suffocating meaning of absolute solitude. While her castle of lies crumbled, I was focused entirely on my reconstruction. I threw myself deeper into the business, not just to heal, but to evolve beyond the woman they had attempted to destroy. I opened my eyes to the opportunities around me, surrounded myself with new people, sharp, trustworthy professionals, and learned the art of making decisions from a place of cold, strategic calm, not reactive emotion. I reinvested heavily in myself, my business education, my networking, my own ideas. Slowly, painstakingly, the pervasive sadness was supplanted by sharp, clear-eyed focus. I discovered the profound, liberating truth that I could be not just happy, but immensely successful, without depending on any external validation. This shift was not about feeling good, it was about gaining untouchable power. I secured a prime commercial lease for a second location, a much larger gallery downtown. Then, within another year, a third, smaller boutique. In less than 36 months, the name Evelyn, the one they had tried to bury under shame, began to resonate throughout the regional luxury consignment industry with genuine respect and admiration. Customers, major suppliers, and even prominent trade magazines were clamoring to know the story of this older woman who had quietly and effectively built a small, impeccable empire from what seemed like nothing. But I wasn't seeking the flash of recognition. My objective was rock-solid stability. The kind of profound, self-created independence I had always vaguely dreamed of was now being built, stone by stone, by my own two hands, and nothing, no man, no friend, could ever take that away from me. The best part? They had no idea I was watching their ruin from my high perch. 3 years passed. My life was completely unrecognizable, serene, robust, entirely without the turmoil of open wounds. The memory of that agonizing night no longer inflicted pain. On the contrary, it served as a powerful, cold reminder of the immense distance I had traveled since that humiliation. I had successfully jettisoned Walter, Doris, and everything their toxic relationship represented. I had learned how to be solitary without feeling empty. And then, at the precise moment I had completely stopped searching for companionship, the unexpected happened. It occurred during a high-stakes, regional business conference, specifically during a panel presentation with several influential entrepreneurs. I met him. His name was Arthur Sterling, a man in his early 60s, and he spoke with a quiet, informed confidence that wasn't intimidating but immediately captivating. He didn't attempt to impress me or aggressively promote himself. He simply listened to my presentation on market trends with rapt attention, then asked a series of deeply insightful questions that no one had ever posed before. I felt no instant, dizzying butterflies. I felt peace. And in that moment of profound, quiet calm, I knew that something significant, something truly authentic, was poised to begin. It felt like the universe was finally paying its debt. With Arthur, everything unfolded differently from the very beginning. There was no urgency, no inflated, empty promises, only sincere, deep conversations, mutual and genuine respect, and silences that were comfortable, meaningful, never awkward. He didn't pressure me to be more or less than I was, nor did he attempt to fill any emotional void left by Walter. He simply accompanied me naturally, allowing me the space to set the measured, cautious pace. Gradually, I began to anticipate his emails, to yearn to hear his low, steady voice, to miss the incredibly focused, respectful way he looked at me. It wasn't the insane, consuming passion I had once mistaken for love. It was something far deeper, far more sustaining. It was a bedrock of peace I had never experienced with anyone before. Initially, I was suspicious of my own happiness, constantly bracing myself for the inevitable moment when everything would inevitably go wrong. But Arthur understood my hesitation without requiring any explanation. He was patient, steadfast, and beautifully consistent. Through every gesture, every action, he demonstrated that genuine love could be built without the need for destruction, without deception, without one person clinging to the other as a life raft. I learned to trust again, not because he demanded it, but because the very nature of his character created a safe, non-judgmental space for me to do so. And with that gentle, persistent reassurance, the last residual scar left by Walter's betrayal finally, fully healed. When we quietly decided to become an official couple, everything flowed with natural ease, with absolutely no need to conceal our affection or justify our relationship. The people around me, including my staff and my family, immediately noticed the palpable change in my demeanor. I was no longer defined as the woman who had merely survived a betrayal. I was the woman who was finally and fully living. With Arthur, I shared business trips, long-term expansion projects, and simple, profound moments that became instantly unforgettable. He didn't promise a mythical future. He offered a solid, dependable, beautiful present. And after everything I had endured, that grounded reality meant infinitely more to me. I was in love, but I was not blinded by it. I don't know the specifics of how Walter discovered my new relationship with Arthur, but the news, like a cold, venomous snake, eventually found its way to him. Soon after, an email arrived in my secure inbox, thick with what was clearly intended to sound like nostalgia and regret. He claimed he was genuinely happy to know I was doing well, suggested he sometimes thought about what we had tragically lost, and offered a shallow wish for my best life. But between every line, the bitter, resentful undertone was unmistakable, the sheer inability of a vain man to accept that the person he thought he had completely ruined could be genuinely happy without him. I did not respond. I owed absolutely nothing, not a word, not a thought, to the man who had attempted to take everything from me and still failed to break my spirit. But this was my chance to finally set the stage for the true, devastating act. One afternoon, entirely without warning, Walter brazenly appeared at the door of my main flagship store, a temple of my success he had never seen. He looked visibly thinner, his eyes dull and restless, his clothing slightly rumpled, carrying the heavy appearance of a man upon whom life had finally placed an unbearable burden. He mumbled a request for just 5 minutes, claiming he desperately needed closure and that he couldn't stop thinking about our past. I looked at him, the ghost of my betrayer, with a profound, icy calm, devoid of all anger or sadness. The pain was gone. He was no longer a person of significance. I instructed him, with firm politeness, to speak quickly, making it absolutely clear that I had no time or inclination for looking backward. He immediately launched into a frantic, self-serving monologue, admitting he had made a terrible mistake, that he had been an unforgivable coward, and that he had only lost me because he hadn't known how to appreciate the treasure he possessed. I listened without interruption, a neutral, mask-like expression fixed upon my face, like someone observing heavy rainfall from the absolute safety of a closed window. When he finally ran out of words, sputtering into an awkward silence, I looked him directly in his dull eyes and delivered my final, unalterable judgment. I told him he no longer possessed any power over me. I stated that we, the couple he had destroyed, no longer existed, and that he should harbor no delusional notion that he could possibly reclaim what he himself had so thoroughly annihilated. I made my boundary absolutely clear. I did not wish to see him again. There was no available space for him in my solid, peaceful present or my meticulously planned future. There were no shouts, no insults, no tears, only a firm, cold, terminal refusal. Walter attempted a nervous, strained smile, as if he still believed he held some vestige of influence over my emotions, some ability to make me waver. But he was no longer the captivating, magnetic man who had once made my heart tremble. He now appeared small, utterly foreign, and overwhelmingly irrelevant. I simply asked him to leave. Before he turned to walk away, his eyes filled with a raw, contained frustration, the clear agony of a man who could not bear to witness my genuine, self-created happiness. He muttered something spiteful about how quickly I had moved on, an obvious attempt to inflict one last, petty sting. But I had no reaction. The comment, which would have shattered the old me, now simply glanced off my armor. He left without a goodbye, his shoulders slumped in defeat, finally internalizing the fact that he had lost me forever, because there was no possibility of a return. When the absolute silence of my successful store finally returned, I sat down at my elegant, antique desk and took a deep, fortifying breath, feeling as if I could, at last, truly live my own life entirely free of any shadow. I felt no childish euphoria or petty triumph, only a profound sense of clean, achieved calm, the kind that settles over a survivor who has successfully closed the toughest chapter of her life without ever dirtying her hands with emotional conflict. I was no longer a victim, a survivor, or anyone's ex. I was simply Evelyn, whole, serene, and absolutely at peace. The groundwork was complete. The final scene could now be written. Arthur walked in a few minutes later, completely unaware of the dramatic encounter. But when he saw the unique stillness on my face, he simply walked over and hugged me without uttering a single word. He didn't require an explanation. He just offered his quiet presence, his unquestioning support, his calm, unconditional love. I looked up at him and knew, with perfect certainty, that life, in all its brutal complexity, had guided me to him for a profound reason. By his side, I felt no more dizzying highs or lows. I felt unequivocally at home. I finally understood what true, enduring love was supposed to feel like. I realized that absolutely nothing in life is guaranteed. That even the most sacredly promised love can instantly break without any warning. And that unwavering loyalty does not always reside in the people closest to you. But I also discovered a deeper, more powerful truth, that pain is never the end of anything, but rather the hard-won beginning of something greater, something we cannot possibly imagine when the wound is fresh. The ruin they created gave me the fertile, perfect ground upon which to rebuild myself, firmer, freer, and infinitely wiser. I learned that anyone who successfully survives such a deep, soul-shattering betrayal doesn't just recover, they are, in essence, reborn. And I had been definitively reborn. But the promise of revenge was still waiting for its moment to blossom. 3 more years accelerated past. My life with Arthur settled into a profound, elegant rhythm. We traveled, we planned the merger of our respective business interests. He owned a highly respected, small-batch jewelry company, a perfect synergy with my consignment empire, and we bought a small, beautiful home on the coast of Maine, a place far removed from the tangled webs of Virginia. I found joy in the mundane, the shared silence over morning coffee, the predictable warmth of his hand in mine, the unforced, simple laughter that erupted unexpectedly. My past was a closed book, a reference manual I consulted only to remember the lessons, never to re-experience the hurt. I had consciously chosen to forgive Walter and Doris, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved the freedom from the heavy anchor of resentment. Forgiveness was a necessary step in my own liberation. But I never said anything about justice. The final pieces of the puzzle concerning Doris were relayed to me by a distant, mutual acquaintance, a former colleague of hers who felt a need to close the loop. Doris had fallen into severe debt, her once flourishing career in landscape architecture withering due to her emotional instability and the toxic reputation that followed her. She had lost her home and was living in a cramped, unappealing apartment, relying on part-time contract work. She had attempted to contact me several times, leaving increasingly desperate, tearful voicemails filled with dramatic apologies and pleas for a reconciliation that would never, under any circumstances, come. She had tried to rebuild her old circle of friends, but her betrayal had become legend, a cautionary tale whispered in polite society. She was perpetually isolated. The woman who had everything, my friendship, her career, my man, had ended up with nothing but the echo of her own greed. It was a perfect, self-inflicted sentence. Walter's fate was equally instructive, though less dramatic. His relationship with the younger woman had predictably imploded within 18 months. He found himself unceremoniously dumped and, more significantly, suffered a devastating financial hit in a risky investment venture. He returned to his old patterns, but the game had changed. He was older, his charm was fading, and his reputation for instability now preceded him. He had become a perpetual, slightly desperate bachelor, hopping between low-value, short-term relationships, unable to find the stability I had offered and the fresh excitement Doris had briefly provided. He was not destitute, but he was profoundly unmoored, perpetually searching for a fixed point he had carelessly thrown away. He was living a life of quiet desperation, the precise opposite of the peace he had once mocked. And so, my ultimate, silent victory was not in any grand, theatrical act of malice, but in the simple, undeniable evidence of my own flourishing life set against the backdrop of their self-destruction. I had risen. They had fallen. I had taken the energy of their betrayal and funneled it into the construction of my empire, while they had consumed their own toxicity. The most powerful weapon I wielded was my ability to simply move on and thrive. But there was one final element, a strategic move I had planned long ago, that brought the entire tableau into chilling focus. One crisp October morning, I was reviewing my property deeds with Arthur in preparation for combining our assets. We came to the document for the Virginia estate, the magical place where my life had shattered and where their affair had reached its climax. I looked at Arthur, who remembered the story only in broad strokes, and smiled a cold, private smile. "This is the last piece of business," I stated. I had held onto the property quietly, allowing it to sit empty, maintained by a property management company, deliberately keeping it off the market. It was a tangible piece of my past, a monument to the betrayal. And now it was time to put it to use. My plan, hatched years prior, was simple, elegant, and deeply psychological. I directed Mr. Hamilton to anonymously purchase the small, dilapidated townhouse where Doris was currently living. It was a purely financial transaction, executed through a series of shell corporations to completely mask my involvement. The next week, she received a formal, completely legal notice of eviction, citing a necessary, upcoming renovation. She had nowhere to go, no resources for a sudden move, and no one she could reasonably ask for help. A few frantic days later, a second, highly unusual offer arrived via certified mail from a separate, anonymous holding company. The offer was a temporary, low-cost lease on a beautiful, spacious home in the hills of Virginia. The catch? The address was the guest cottage on the grounds of the grand estate where she had betrayed me on my wedding night. The place of her greatest triumph would now be the cage of her greatest humiliation. The psychological torment of Doris's situation, entirely orchestrated by my anonymous action, began immediately. She was desperate. The offer was too generous to refuse, and the location, though vaguely familiar, simply registered as a necessity. She moved into the elegant, but distinctly separate, guest cottage on the periphery of the vast Virginia estate. For the first several months, she lived there in relative peace, thinking she had simply caught an extraordinary, if random, break. She began to find sporadic, local work. But the knowledge of the main manor house, the one she had helped desecrate, loomed constantly. She would often walk the winding paths, the very paths where she had once walked confidently as my maid of honor, and feel a deep, unsettling sense of déjà vu. She didn't know who owned the property, only that it remained eerily, perpetually vacant. The emptiness of the manor house was a mirror reflecting the emptiness of her life. I had instructed the property manager to execute the next phase. Subtle changes began to take place on the grounds. First, the string lights that had illuminated our disastrous rehearsal dinner patio were restrung and illuminated every night, bathing the courtyard in a haunting yellow glow. Then, an antique phonograph was placed in the main hall of the manor house, and, through its open windows, the soft, melancholic strains of the same jazz music that had played during our engagement party began to drift down to the cottage every evening, starting precisely at sunset. Doris, already frayed by stress, began to suffer from severe, debilitating nightmares. She heard footsteps on the gravel where there were none, and saw the flicker of candlelit tables in the main house windows, only to have the image vanish upon closer inspection. She became convinced the place was subtly haunted, constantly playing the soundtrack to her betrayal. She was experiencing a relentless, personalized form of psychological torture, and she couldn't prove a single thing. Walter's role in this final act was different, a strategic exposure designed not to hurt him, but to break the last vestiges of Doris's sanity. By chance, or perhaps by my subtle nudging through shared professional contacts, Walter was hired by the property management firm that supposedly owned the Virginia estate. His task, a series of small, intermittent maintenance and repair jobs on the guest cottage. He was to be a constant, visible, and deeply unwelcome presence in Doris's life. She was forced to see him, her former lover, her co-conspirator, not as a partner, but as a groundskeeper, a low-paid service worker hired by the same invisible, all-powerful entity that controlled her temporary home. The humiliation of seeing her grand passion reduced to a blue-collar subordinate was exquisite. Their encounters were brief, cold, and fraught with mutual resentment. They spoke only of leaky faucets and broken screens, their once secretive passion reduced to the transactional language of maintenance requests. Doris watched Walter struggle with simple tasks, noticing his aging body, his perpetual fatigue, and the defeat in his eyes. He saw Doris confined to the small cottage, her once vibrant beauty diminished by stress and isolation, completely dependent on the very system he was now serving. They were trapped together, two rats in a velvet cage, forced to witness each other's failures, all orchestrated by an unseen hand they both vaguely feared. They separated, more violently antagonistic than ever, both convinced the other was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The silence of my revenge was far louder than any scream they could muster. The torment escalated for Doris. She started noticing deliberate, unsettling details. Once, she found a single, perfectly preserved white wedding petal, one of the same variety from my ceremony, placed meticulously on her doorstep. Another time, the small bird bath in the cottage garden was filled not with water, but with the specific, rare vintage of Bordeaux that had been served at my reception. These occurrences were impossible to explain. They felt personal, targeted, and completely insane. She started documenting the events, taking frantic photographs of the illuminated patio and the inexplicable appearance of objects, convinced she was being systematically gaslighted. Her attempts to speak to the owner or the management firm were met with polite, impenetrable legal stone walls and constant reassurances that she was a valued tenant and that all issues were merely the result of an overeager maintenance crew, meaning Walter. Walter, in his role as the intermittent repairman, was also suffering. He had a natural curiosity, and the persistent presence of the jazz music and the lit-up manor house began to unsettle him. He once dared to sneak into the main hall while the property manager was absent. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. The hall was set exactly as it had been on the day of my wedding, the tables laid for dinner, the candles in place, though unlit and too large. Life-size photographs of me and Doris from our pre-wedding years placed on an easel, smiling innocently at each other. He fled the manor house, convinced his guilt was driving him mad, only to run directly into a hysterically crying Doris near the cottage. The manor house was no longer a place of betrayal. It was a shrine to the loss it had witnessed. Their desperate reunion in the face of this shared terror was brief and toxic. Doris frantically showed Walter her photo documentation, pleading with him to admit he was somehow being used or that they were being collectively punished. Walter, seeing his own terror reflected in the tableau inside the manor, merely lashed out, accusing her of having always been paranoid and suggesting her isolation had made her unstable. They blamed each other for their shared fate, the venom of their initial deceit consuming the last remnants of their former passion. The knowledge that they were two peas in a pod equally deserving of this quiet, persistent hell was the final, sharp knife turn. They separated, more violently antagonistic than ever, both convinced the other was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. My life, meanwhile, continued its graceful upward trajectory. Arthur and I completed our business merger, creating a formidable, diversified luxury company. We spent weekends sailing off the Maine coast, our conversations focused on long-term strategy, art, and the comforting predictability of our mutual devotion. My former life was a distant, cold memory I sometimes observed in the news, which occasionally ran small, forgettable articles about the decline of a once prominent local landscape architect, Doris, or the financial troubles of a former venture capitalist, Walter. They were cautionary footnotes. I was the thriving chapter. One evening, Arthur and I were attending a sophisticated charity gala in Boston. I was radiant, wearing a custom-designed gown and his latest piece of exquisite jewelry. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Edith, Walter's mother, who had been genuinely devastated by her son's actions and the family shame. She hadn't seen me since that terrible morning. She looked old, fragile, and deeply remorseful. She confessed, tears welling in her eyes, that she had always adored me and had never forgiven her son for his despicable cruelty. She leaned in conspiratorially and whispered, "Evelyn, you deserve everything good in the world." I saw the signs, but I was too weak. Now, the way he and Doris are living, it's like a curse has been put on them. A slow, painful reckoning. I almost pity them. Edith's quiet acknowledgement that night in Boston was the unofficial confirmation I required. The world was beginning to recognize the natural, karmic consequence of their actions, even if they couldn't name the architect. Walter continued his sporadic, resented work on the Virginia estate. Doris continued to hear the music, see the lights, and live under the perpetual, invisible scrutiny of the manor house's windows. Her mental state deteriorated further. She started leaving desperate, rambling notes for the owner, the same faceless entity, pleading with them to stop the haunting, to reveal themselves, to let her pay any price for peace. I read every one of those notes, forwarded discreetly by the property manager. They were raw, desperate pleas for sanity, confirming that the silent torment had achieved its precise, desired effect. She had exchanged her peace for a temporary passion, and the bill was now due, with crippling interest. I realized that my scheme had achieved more than revenge. It had provided me with a profound, final closure. By creating a physical and psychological hell for them in the very place they had celebrated their infidelity, I had externalized the pain, making their environment a living monument to their guilt. I was finally ready to dismantle the monument. It was time to sell the estate. The only question remaining was how to deliver the final, devastating reveal. I waited until the spring, when the gardens were in glorious, suffocating bloom, a cruel mirror of the beauty on my wedding day. I instructed Mr. Hamilton to arrange an exclusive viewing for a high-profile, discreet buyer. The property management company, in turn, informed Doris that the property was finally being sold and that her temporary lease would terminate in 90 days. The temporary peace she had found was being ripped away, leaving her truly homeless. Walter, hearing the same news, experienced a flicker of his old, avaricious self, wondering if he could somehow get a finder's fee or a commission. The day of the viewing arrived. I, Evelyn, did not attend. Instead, I sent Mr. Hamilton and the property manager. Doris was confined to her cottage, but could see the black limousines and the sharp, powerful figures moving around the grounds. Walter was present, instructed to make sure the manor house was in immaculate condition. As he dusted a side table in the main hall, he found a small, antique, silver picture frame, perfectly clean, placed face down. He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. He recognized the frame. It was a small engagement gift I had given him years ago. He turned it over. The photograph inside was not of me, nor of Doris. It was a picture of him and me, taken on the day we purchased the estate, signed on the back with a single word in my handwriting, remember. The single word remember was the final, devastating psychological blow. Walter felt the floor tilt beneath him. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that the haunting was not a curse, not a hallucination, but a meticulously planned, deliberate act of retribution orchestrated by the woman he had discarded. He understood, in that paralyzing moment, that the owner of the house, the entity controlling his every move and Doris's despair, had been Evelyn all along. The jazz music, the illuminated patio, the oppressive silence, all were custom-made torments designed by the victim he thought he had destroyed. He stumbled out of the manor house and ran directly toward the cottage, ignoring the wealthy prospective buyers on the lawn. He found Doris on her porch, packing boxes, her face etched with defeat. He showed her the photograph, his hand shaking violently, unable to speak, only able to point. Doris looked at the picture, at the young, hopeful faces, at my handwriting, and then at the grandeur of the house looming behind them. The puzzle pieces, the years of subtle, personalized torture, snapped into place with a horrifying, absolute clarity. The truth, silent and cold, hit her with the force of a physical blow. They stood there, two broken people in the golden light of the afternoon, the truth hanging heavy and palpable between them. They realized that their betrayal had not led to a passionate new life, but to a predetermined, 7-year period of carefully managed psychological purgatory. The love they thought they had shared had been merely a tool in Evelyn's long, silent game of dominance. They tried to speak, to justify, to deny, but all that came out was mutually destructive recrimination, a furious, final burst of blame for the paths their selfishness had carved. Walter screamed at Doris for being weak enough to take the lease. Doris screamed back that he was a narcissistic coward who never deserved either of them. The illusion of their shared bond, already fragile, was irrevocably shattered by the knowledge that they had been puppets on my string. I was 3 states away, sitting on the porch of my main home with Arthur, sipping tea and watching the waves. The property manager sent me a discreet text message confirming the viewing had concluded, the contract was signed, and that both the tenant and the maintenance worker were in the process of severe emotional distress. It was over. The next day, Doris was officially evicted. She left the cottage with 2 suitcases, leaving behind a frantic, tear-stained note addressed to Evelyn in the mailbox. It was not an apology. It was a desperate expression of awe at my cold, meticulous brilliance. Walter, suddenly jobless and confronting the magnitude of his life's failure, packed up his old car, and drove away from the Virginia estate, never to return. My silent, slow-burning scheme of revenge was complete, and its greatest triumph was that they could never prove a thing. Today, I write this from the sun-drenched terrace of my home in Maine, a cup of perfectly brewed tea resting on the railing as Arthur reads a history book beside me. The scent of pine and salt air replaces the stale perfume of resentment. Peace doesn't announce itself with the clamor of fireworks or the flash of a grand revelation. It sounds like a shared silence, the rhythm of mutual respect, and the quiet, solid knowledge that nothing is missing. Arthur looks up, catches my eye, and smiles, a genuine, unforced expression that reaches his eyes. He is the best reminder that love doesn't demand absurd sacrifices or ask you to diminish yourself. True love begins when you decide not to beg for affection, when you know that whoever chooses you must choose you freely, entirely for who you are, scars and all. My story concludes, not with a dramatic, movie-style confrontation, but with this perfect, profound tranquility. I sold the Virginia estate for a significant profit, the funds of which I used to establish a small foundation focused on helping women over 60 restart their careers after sudden personal hardship. The act was not born of pity, but of purpose. I never saw Walter or Doris again. Not because I had granted them forgiveness, but because they no longer occupied any valuable, necessary space within my mind or my heart. They are merely concepts now, symbols of a hard-won lesson. Sometimes, people ask me if I regret the years I spent formulating and executing my silent revenge. And I answer honestly, I regret the betrayal, but I do not regret the response. My revenge was not about making them suffer a physical fate. It was about controlling the narrative and the setting of their own consequence. It was about using my sharp intellect and my financial freedom to demonstrate that their casual, heartless destruction was not without a powerful, sophisticated cost. By orchestrating their proximity and their humiliation in the physical space of their crime, I took back the power they had stolen. I forced them to face the ugliness of their own actions every single day, while I built a beautiful, unassailable life. My happy ending was not finding a perfect man, it was becoming the invincible woman who no longer needed to be saved from anything. I look back now, 6 years removed from the day I asked for the annulment, and I see the scars, yes, but more prominently, I see the strength that those scars forged. I learned that pain is a profound, albeit terrible, teacher. It breaks you, but it also builds you up again, wiser, more aware, and profoundly more you. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Don't let yourself be broken by someone who doesn't know how to truly love. Don't remain where there is no respect. The strongest love is the one you cultivate for yourself. Everything else, when it comes, should only be a complement, never the essential center of your life. And so, my story ends with a cup of warm tea, Arthur's hand resting lightly on my shoulder, and a heart finally, completely at peace. The woman who walked barefoot down that muddy road in her stained wedding dress is now the master of her own dignified destiny. Did you anticipate the final reveal of the Virginia estate's owner? I'd love to know which part of my long, silent game you found the most satisfying. Tell me in the comments.